Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the Institute of Military Technology, taking a look at some of the interesting firearms that they have in the reference collection here. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the German MP38 and MP40, because there are a couple of differences between these guns, and I think a lot of people probably don't know what those differences are or why. So the MP38 was the first submachine gun really formally on a large scale adopted by the German military. It was based on the Irma MP36 prototypes, which were pretty heavily based on Schmeisser patents. So the design traits of this gun actually really go back to the MP18 from World War I. The bolts of these guns and the MP18 are very, very similar, and the magazines are also quite similar. In fact, that's one of their weak points, is the magazine for the MP38 and 40. And by the way, the magazines are interchangeable and identical for the 38 and the 40. Those magazines are a carryover from the MP18. They are a double stack, single feed magazine, which is, it's simpler to design a gun around because there's only one position that a cartridge comes into. I should specify, single feed means that the cartridges taper into a single stack at the top. And there's only one cartridge sitting at the top of the magazine that can feed. A double feed magazine is one where two cartridges come up side by side. This one will feed, and then this one's on top and it feeds, and then the next one. The advantage of a double feed magazine is that there's less friction because you're not trying to take this stack of cartridges and compress them into a single stack. That means that they're more reliable to shoot, they require a little less spring tension. It also means they're a lot easier to load, especially if you don't have a special loading tool. So double feed is better, but single feed is what they'd used on the MP18, and that design just carried over into the MP38 and MP40. Anyway, I digress. So the design came through Irma. They did some testing on the MP36. They ended up adopting it in the form of the MP38 in July of 1938. They only made 1,000 of them in 38, and then production ramped up until it finally ended in 1942. They had a total of about 42,200 MP38s manufactured. And by the time those were done, they had transitioned to the MP40. Now, the differences between these two guns are not mechanical at all, really. They are industrial. So what they did was they took the MP38, which has, interestingly, it's a tube receiver submachine gun, but it's an entirely machined receiver. So they took a piece of bar stock, drilled out the middle, and then machined down the outside and added this fluting in to reduce weight. It was an incredibly expensive way to build a gun like that. And with the MP40, they realized, wow, we can do this a lot more simply and a lot cheaper by using a stamped sheet metal tube. So that's the primary difference between the 38 and the 40s. The 38 is a milled gun, the 40 is just a stamped tube. Now that carried over to some of the other parts as well. You can see that we have a smooth-sided magazine well here with a hole in the middle to reduce weight. They decided the hole wasn't worth the trouble, so on the early MP40s, they just went to this smooth-sided magazine well. On the late MP40s, they decided they could make the metal thinner and stamp some ribs in it for reinforcing to make up for it. So simplifications followed within the MP40. So a bunch of changes from 38 to 40, and then some smaller changes as the war progressed. Pretty much every country, but especially Germany and also Japan, simplified their guns as the war progressed because the economy tightened up. They needed to be able to produce more stuff with less material. All right, now there are some other smaller details that did change, so why don't we take a closer look at each of these three progressing guns, and I'll show you the small details. So we've grown accustomed to thinking of the MP40 as a second generation stamped metal gun. Well, the MP38 really, while it retains that same look, it really was much more of a first generation, expensive, milled submachine gun. If you look at the quality of the machining on this receiver tube, it's really just a coincidence that this is tubular in shape instead of being some other milled shape, because they put as much work into this as they would have into something like a Thompson submachine gun receiver. This is an interesting element that the Germans added because they recognized that these guns were going to be used largely by mechanized troops. And that was some of the original design intent for these submachine guns were mechanized troops and paratroops who needed a compact weapon. The idea with this is this was originally aluminum. They also did some stamped steel and some Bakelite, and as repairs actually wooden. guards here, this is a hook that allows you to put this over the edge of the door, or the armor side of your armored personnel carrier, your half-track, your Kubelwagen, and you can hook the gun over that when you're shooting to make sure that the gun doesn't unintentionally recoil back into the vehicle and shoot things that you don't want to be shooting. So that's an interesting element that not a lot of other people actually copied. So a couple of other early elements. This is for both early 38s and 40s. The muzzle nut had this full threading on it, knurling on it. That's just a muzzle protector. And then it also has this hook on here, this machined thing, and that's for a muzzle cap. Now they fairly quickly realized that the muzzle cap was extraneous and unnecessary, so they stopped producing them and also stopped machining the front of the front sight tower to include them. As I mentioned a moment ago, the magazine wells on the MP38s are smooth-sided with a weight reduction hole, and they have this, there are a bunch of changes to these guns that are kind of aesthetic only, like the pattern of the checkering on the magazine release button there, and so we'll ignore those for the time being. Speaking of the smooth-sided magazine well, the early MP38 magazines were also smooth-sided like this. Now they continued that into production of the MP40 before they eventually went to a thinner metal and a rib instead for strength. Another interesting uneconomical feature on the MP38s, this grip frame assembly here. This is Bakelite plastic, but the grip frame was actually made out of aluminum. That did not last long into the war effort because, of course, aluminum was a much more expensive material than steel, and the available aluminum was all going into aircraft production. There was no real need to make a part like this on a submachine gun out of aluminum. So one of the changes with the MP40 was replacing this with steel. Before we move on, we'll just take a quick look at the markings here. It does say MP38. 27 is the German factory code for Irma. The MP38s were manufactured only by two companies, Irma and Haenel, and this is a 1938 production gun. Oh, and lastly, note that the rear sight is actually screwed in place. You've got two sight settings there, but the relevant point is that the sight base is screwed down. Now, moving on to the MP40, we now have significant simplification. We have a lot of stamped parts. The receiver is now stamped, a couple large ribs in it to reinforce it. Our front magazine well here is stamped instead of being machined. It's still flat-sided. They got away from the hole in the center, was just not substantial enough to deal with. On this particular example, we even have a stamped front guard here. This is not original. A gun of this period should have had a machined steel one. This was added later at some point. The original was probably damaged. And this pistol grip assembly is now steel. And that actually goes all the way up into here and mounts the folding stock. So this is a 1940 production gun. You can see it's now marked MP40. And some of these early elements remained on the early MP40s, things like the muzzle cover adapter there and this style of muzzle nut. Now, moving to a later MP40, we can see a few more changes happening, and these get to be pretty small changes. For one thing, we now have a ribbed magazine, and the most visible change here, and this is the case on most of the MP40s that you'll find, is the magazine well. That magazine well now has these distinctive stamped ribs to strengthen it. It's still a stamped part as opposed to being milled on the MP38. We now have a Bakelite protector here. The muzzle nut attachment is gone, and we now have this split knurling on the muzzle nut. Not sure exactly why they did that. They probably decided it was a little bit easier to get a grip on. Now, since I know some people are going to ask, we'll take a quick look at disassembling this gun, because it's super easy, but it's not necessarily the most intuitive thing. So if you look at the bottom of the grip, or rather the bottom of the stock assembly, you'll find this, which looks like a screw. Let me get the stock out of the way. This is not a screw. This is simply a plunger. And what we need to do is lift it up and rotate it 90 degrees. There you go. You can see that's now sitting up. Now, in order to remove the entire top half of the gun from the lower housing, going to pull the trigger, the bolts forward so it's safe, and we're going to rotate the whole receiver clockwise. We do that about 90 degrees, and then the two halves just come apart. Trigger is really simple in this. There is, by the way, no semi-auto setting on an MP40. It is safe or full auto. Once we have the lower housing off, we can then pull out the recoil spring and the bolt. Unlike a lot of open bolt submachine guns, this does not have a fixed firing pin. The firing pin is actually connected to the recoil spring assembly, but the rest of this bolt is very similar to that of an MP18. Now you'll notice this bolt handle looks a little different than the others. We'll take a look at that once we're done with disassembly. The recoil spring is one of the kind of iconic features of the MP38 and 40 in that it's this telescoping design. The spring is inside here, firing pins fixed on the front, and it all collapses together. Now the advantage of this is that you don't get dirt and grime inside the spring itself. You might get gunk inside the receiver, but it's a lot easier to clean this off than to take a coil spring and try and wipe, say, sand out of a coil spring. So that's a cool feature. As an open bolt submachine gun, these are really simple mechanisms. That's really all there is to it. Now, the design of the bolt handle was a change that a lot of people think is associated with the change from the MP38 to the 40, but it's actually not. The 38s and the early MP40s have this standard kind of hook-shaped charging handle. And that's how it works. And if you want to safe the gun, we have a safety notch back here. Pull the bolt back, rotate the handle up into that notch, bolt's locked in place, can't go anywhere. However, this did leave a safety issue. If you happen to be, let's say you're climbing out of the turret of a tank with your MP40, and this hook catches on the inside of the turret, and it pulls back to, say, here. At this point, it has cleared the magazine, but it has not caught the sear. If it pulls back to here, and then you yank it free, it will then run forward, strip a cartridge out of the magazine, and fire unintentionally, and likely shoot you. This is a problem. Now, this rear safety catch doesn't really do anything to ameliorate that. Instead, and this was causing serious safety issues. This was a problem that the German army was well aware of. And their interim solution was actually to issue a leather strap that you could lock around the bolt handle, kind of like the hammer tie down on like a single action revolver holster, that would hold the bolt forward and prevent it from going back. But that's really a kludge of a solution. So instead, what they came up with in July of 1942 was this redesign of the bolt handle. With this new handle design, you can push the bolt handle in towards the center of the gun, and that locks the bolt in place. When you're ready to fire, you pull the bolt back out, and then it can cycle. That was a much better solution. However, by the time they came up with it, it was summer of '42, and they had a lot of these guns out in the field. So there was an order put out to retrofit all of the hook safeties with these, which isn't just a matter of replacing the bolt handle. They also have to cut a little notch in the receiver here for it to function in. You can see that notch right there. And apparently it didn't really work. They were supposed to have completed the transition universally by May of '43, but later in '43 another order came out still talking about getting this update done. And as you can see, we have guns like this MP40, which is quite early, which never got the update done. But that's why that bolt handle is there. That's what it's supposed to do. And this is also an important safety lesson for anyone who has an open bolt submachine gun that they are taking out, loading up, and shooting, is be aware that safety procedures are a bit different for open bolt guns than they are for closed bolt guns. In all of its forms, the MP38 and MP40 was a remarkably good submachine gun. Really, the magazine was a bit of a weak point to it, and I personally am not a big fan of the underfolding stock, but these guns served very well. They were well liked by the guys who had them, and they did good service. So, hard to complain about that. I would like to thank the Institute of Military Technology for letting me take a look at these three. There are not a whole lot of MP38s around, so it's pretty cool to find not just one of those, but one with the other later variants as well, so that we can compare them. If you're interested in small arms design and research, the IMT collection isn't generally open to the public, but it is available by appointment. So check them out, get in contact, and arrange a trip down here to do some research or just have a tour of the collection. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And if you enjoy seeing videos like this, please do consider heading over to my Patreon page and subscribing there. It is contributions from folks who do that, who make it possible for me to continue to travel about, find these guns, and bring them to you. Thanks for watching.